Hello and welcome to this analysis of Plato's dialogue Alcibiades. Um, so I thought I would go through some of the major themes, arguments, and kind of context of the dialogue, some of the implications of it. So I thought I would begin by just pointing out some historical background to Alcibiades as a character. This dialogue is exclusively Socrates and Alcibiades. Alcibiades is known as a kind of ambitious young Athenian, and in this dialogue, he is about 20. I think he's in the early 20s. Maybe I think it says 20 actually. So he's still a very young man, and he's very ambitious, and he has a real respect for Socrates, even though he's exemplifies, I think, a lot of the typical characteristics of kind of the Athenian kind of ruling class, we could probably say, which Plato, I think, wants to do something about, moderate or discipline or something like that, but he's not this complete obnoxious idiot either. He is a very astute learner. He is really willing to listen to Socrates. He's really willing to follow through the arguments. He's enthusiastic about it. He sees it as being conducive to his own personal improvement, and so forth. If you had to pick a few major themes that are present in this dialogue, you would probably say something like ambition, how philosophy can relate to ambition, political leadership, what makes a just ruler, what makes a good ruler, because we're not just speaking of some moderate individual improving, we're speaking of someone who has the potential to become a political, social leader. We're speaking of, I think, themes of friendship and mentorship as well. Socrates is also trying to show what would make a good mentor to this young man, and he's trying to show what would make a good student. Alcibiades, his father is dead, and he's being raised by Pericles. So Pericles was basically in charge of the Athenian city-state at the time. But it's an interesting theme to just point out that his father is dead. So there is this kind of character of, and his guardian is obviously very busy the whole time because he's ruling the city. So there is an underlying theme, I think, of this young man being a bit neglected or being a bit lost. He's looking for a leader. He's looking for a kind of perhaps a father figure or a mentor, and he eventually comes across Socrates. And there's also a sort of coming of age theme to this as well, I think, in the sense that the dialogue begins with Socrates admitting that he's always kept his eye out for Alcibiades. He's always been interested in his development, we could say, and he never really he never really tried to create a more direct relationship with him until now. And he says the oracle told him it wasn't time, and the oracle has now told him it is time. So this is, I would interpret this as being a very ancient Greek way of saying it would have been unhelpful, or perhaps we could say it would have been too early for Alcibiades to encounter Socrates, encounter the kind of Socratic process until now. So the stars are aligned, it's time, and this is where the dialogue kicks off. Now, some historical comparisons to these two characters, Socrates and Alcibiades. They both have a pretty bad relationship at the end of the day with the Athenian state. As we know, Socrates is eventually put on trial, found guilty of corrupting the youth, an interesting accusation considering right now he's trying to help a youth. But he's convicted of corrupting the youth, and even Alcibiades is used as evidence against him because he had a close relationship with Alcibiades, and Alcibiades ended up basically going over to the Spartans, and eventually I think he left the Spartans and lived somewhere else in Greece, and was eventually killed or assassinated by no one really knows who. He ended up having a lot of enemies at the end of the day. So both Socrates and Alcibiades had a pretty antagonistic relationship with the Athenian state. So they're kind of kindred spirits in that regard. And they're also kindred spirits in the regard that they're both exceptional people. Obviously, Socrates is exceptional. Alcibiades was extremely ambitious, kind of charming, well-spoken, determined, and he was a military general. He became a military general, and there's a kind of Alexander the Great vibe to him. You know, a kind of ambitious youth with big plans for the expansion of Greek power and Greek culture. And obviously, Alexander the Great had a relationship with Aristotle as well, although I don't know how. I'm not sure how much of a one or how seriously Alexander ever took philosophy, but there was some attempt there to let's say supplement an ambitious young Greek man with a philosophic guardian. And the philosophic guardian is interesting for Socrates and Alcibiades as well, because Socrates fought in the Battle of Delium and the Battle of Potaida, and it is said that Socrates once saved Alcibiades when he was injured, and Alcibiades once saved Socrates, I think, when they were retreating or something, and he came up and picked him up on horseback before he could be killed. So there's not just a philosophic kind of mentorship relationship between these two. Throughout, history, there's also been a quite literal guardianship, kind of a reciprocal guardianship role going on. So that's another interesting historical fact to keep in mind. A thorough reading of this dialogue, you can see immediately that some of the, let's say, more liberally inclined recent commentaries on this dialogue tend to frame it something like Alcibiades wants to get into politics, and Socrates is the philosopher who says, don't get into politics, do philosophy. And this is absolute nonsense. For Plato, there is no real distinction between... it's not there's not a distinction, there's no simple separation between the philosophical life and the political life. Plato is clearly trying to create a political system which moves through and incorporates philosophy and philosophers into it. There's not this clear separation. There's a kind of cliche recently of Socrates as this kind of very marginal external figure who wanders around, in town somewhere, who wants everyone to kind of live this life, having these abstract logical conversations about, you know, beauty or something. And this is not the case. Socrates is extremely politically inclined, and doesn't want to draw ambitious young men away from politics. He wants them to be ready for politics. And there's a risk of politics only insofar as if one doesn't prepare for it using philosophy, one can be overwhelmed and corrupted by it. But this isn't the same thing as to say, don't go near politics. Politics is bad. Just, come with me and live in the woods and we'll have these abstract philosophical dialogues. No, philosophy is in a sense a part of the educational process which prepares one for politics, and politics is clearly, to Plato, a total necessity and a part of any sort of city state, any sort of civilized life, and there's no escaping that. I think there's a a kind of anti-political, depoliticized, liberal framing of Socrates sometimes within kind of contemporary commentaries, especially coming out of academia, and which wish to kind of treat politics as if it's merely this kind of dirty, stupid thing which real philosophers would never dare go near. This isn't about that. Within the theme of the oracle telling Socrates that that it is time to speak to Alcibiades, and warning him not to get into politics, but to be ready for politics, and to not jump into it when you're not ready. There's a temporal theme of readiness here. Politics is not bad in and of itself. It's not anti-philosophical. It's not opposed to philosophy. It's just that philosophy can help us understand politics and help us understand when our participation in it is good and when it's bad, and when we are ready for it and when we are not. In fact, the part of Socrates' dialogue and his communication with Alcibiades is not only is he not trying to convince him to be against politics, or to wander around like him, supposedly completely disinterested in politics or something. He's actually aware and encouraging not only a eventual political life for Alcibiades, but an almost imperially political life. He's talking about how Alcibiades could one day rival the kings of Sparta and the kings of Persia, and how he even says, here in Europe is to be your seat of empire, and you must not cross over into Asia or meddle with Asiatic affairs. I do not believe that you would choose to live upon these terms, but the world, as I may say, must be filled with your power and name. No man less than Cyrus and Xerxes is of any account with you. Such I know to be your hopes. I am not guessing only, and very likely you, who know that I am speaking the truth, will reply, well, Socrates, but what have my hopes to do with the explanation which you promised of your unwillingness to leave me, and so forth. So you can see in the dialogues that he's not only not saying, Alcibiades, stay away from politics, he's actually saying that you will become a continental king. What is Socrates trying to restrain Alcibiades from, or redirect Alcibiades away from? Because there is an encouragement of his ambition, but there's also a attempt to direct and shape that ambition to not fall into certain traps. And we've just discussed the political trap. It's not anti-politics. It's not understanding, let's say, certain elements of political life and not being ready for it, which could be corruptive. But there's other things that Socrates is warning him against more directly. As we said before, don't go to Asia. He's warning him against getting too enthralled with Asiatic affairs. So there's already a kind of common Greek suspicion of Asia. Um, the other thing that Socrates ends up warning Alcibiades away from is when Alcibiades and Socrates engage in this typical dialogue of trying to define the just, or trying to define how one knows the just. Also, we go through various kind of logical steps of the dialogue, and they're trying to understand where their assumption about what is just comes from, and we ultimately end up with the conclusion that Alcibiades thinks that what is just, his assumptions about what is just, have come from the many, what is translated in this Benjamin Jowett translation as the many. Now, the many is basically not the people, but it is a democratic sentiment, basically. So Socrates is actually, he's not warning them against politics. He's basically warning him against democracy. He's like, don't think the many actually have any clue of what they're talking about. So as we go through the dialogue, we see that the discussion is, a typically Socratic inquiry into forms which are probably most relevant to political life, like justice and courage. And there's a debate over whether the just and the expedient are the same, or are they not the same. There's some discussion over the nature of courage and so forth. But as usual, we see that we don't have a clear definition of these things, and that the person who assumed that they had some sort of notion of them has very little notion of them. And this isn't to deter Alcibiades from his ambition, isn't to say, well, look, you don't know what courage really means. You don't know what justice really is. So go watch Netflix or something, right? Or whatever the equivalent in ancient Greece was to Netflix. The point is simply to say that to experience this perplexity, this aporia, is necessary for an ambitious young man to encounter, should he want to become more politically inclined, because the danger isn't of course that you don't know what justice is. It's that you think you do, and you go into power thinking you do, and then you do stupid things. And we learned that Socrates is quite dismissive of pretty much everyone in power in Athens, except for Pericles, as they all basically think they know what the just is, and they don't, and they're in power, and they don't even know that they don't know, so they shouldn't be in power. And it brings up the secondary theme of, well, if everyone around you for the most part is stupid, who can you look up to? Who can you engage with? From whom and where can you find wisdom? And it's here where we enter into a comparison between Athens and Sparta, and a comparison between Athens and Persia. And there is a theme in certain of Plato's dialogues where he's trying to, let's say, put some humility on the arrogance which is developed in Athens because of its success, because it's suddenly gotten richer, it's more powerful, and so forth. And it's obviously become a kind of cultural powerhouse in the ancient world. So we have this interesting part of the dialogue where Socrates basically criticizes Pericles kind of subtly, given that he's Alcibiades' guardian, and we acknowledge that Pericles is a great man. He's like the only like kind of valuable leader in Athens, basically. And excuse me, and then Socrates kind of asks about Alcibiades' brother, who was also brought up by Pericles, and Pericles' own sons. And Alcibiades says his brother is a madman, he's a stupid, and Socrates says that Pericles' sons are simpletons. And we're kind of wondering, well, how did this happen? How did this happen if the father is so is the only wise political ruler in Athens? How did like all the young men around them become so stupid? And so it brings up this larger question of education and mentorship and so forth. And again, this sort of brings us back to the start of the dialogue, where Alcibiades, he's really looking for a mentor because he doesn't have one. So there's a secondary theme here of neglect, that these young members of Athenian society don't really have any valid mentors, education, discipline, and so forth to really turn them into acceptable leaders in the future. So it brings up this question of kind of legacy and inheritance, and kind of the intergenerational transmission of wisdom and authority through a society. And it's here where we go into a kind of discussion where we compare Athens in more detail to the Persians and to the Spartans. And so Socrates, so this is a slightly long passage that I might read some or most of. So Socrates says, let us compare our antecedents with those of the Spartans and the Persian kings. Are they inferior to us in descent? Have we not heard that the former are sprung from Heracles and the latter from Achaemenes, and that the race of Heracles and the race of Achaemenes go back to Perseus, son of Zeus? And Alcibiades says, why, so does mine go back to Eurysakes and he to Zeus? And Socrates says, and mine to Daedalus and he to Hephaestus, son of Zeus. But for all that, we are far inferior to them, for they are descended from Zeus through a line of kings, either kings of Argos or Sparta, or kings of Persia, a country which the descendants of the Achaemenes have always possessed, besides being at various times sovereigns of Asia, as they are now, whereas we and our fathers were but private citizens. How ridiculous would you be thought if you were to make a display of your ancestors and of Salamis, the island of Eurysakes, or of Aegina? And just a side note, I think that Alcibiades is claiming that his ancestor is Ajax, and Socrates' ancestor goes back to a famous stone. I think it's a stonemason called Daedalus. So yeah, so like both of these guys have let's say kind of like a kind of claim to some sort of divine lineage, but unlike the Persians and unlike the Spartans, they live in a democracy. So there's basically a subtle attack on the democracy going on here too, because it doesn't keep that lineage going. You're basically ruled by people maybe that don't have a connection to some sort of divine ancestry and so forth. Again, doesn't really fit into the liberal category of, politics bad, go do philosophy in the woods on your own. Anyway, so we continue, and Socrates, he's trying to kind of he's really trying to lower the arrogance basically of the Athenians here, and he says, you should consider how inferior we are to them both in the derivation of our birth and in other particulars. Did you never observe how great it is the property of the Spartan kings, and their wives are under the guardianship of the ephori, who are public officers and watch over them, in order to preserve as far as possible the purity of the Heraclid blood? Still greater is the difference among the Persians, for no one entertains a suspicion that the father of a prince of Persia can be anyone but the king. Such is the awe which invests the person of the queen, that any other guard is needless. And when the heir of the kingdom is born, all the subjects of the king feast, and the day of his birth is forever afterwards kept as a holiday and time of sacrifice by all Asia. Whereas when you and I were born, Alcibiades, as the comic poet says, the neighbors hardly knew of the important event. After the birth of the royal child, he is tended, not by a good-for-nothing woman nurse, but by the best of the royal eunuchs, who are charged with the care of him, and especially with fashioning a right formation of his limbs, in order that he may be as shapely as possible, which being their calling, they are held in great honor. And when the young prince is 7 years old, he is put on a horse and taken to the riding masters, and begins to go out hunting. And at 14 years of age, he is handed over to the royal schoolmasters, and they are termed, these are 4 chosen men, reputed to be the best among the Persians of a certain age. And one of them is the wisest, and the other the justest, and the third the most temperate, and the fourth the most valiant. The first instructs him on the Magianism of the Zoroaster, the son of Oromasus, which is the worship of the gods, and teaches him all the duties of his royal office. The second, who is the justice, teaches him always to speak the truth. The third, the most temperate, forbids him to allow any pleasure to be lord over him, that he must be accustomed to be a free man and king indeed, lord of himself first and not a slave. The most valiant trains him to be bold and fearless, telling him that if he fears, he is to deem himself a slave. Whereas Pericles gave you, Alcibiades, for a tutor, Zopyrus the Thracian, a slave of his who was past all other work. I might enlarge the nurture and education of our rivals, but that would be tedious, and I have said what I have said is a sufficient sample of what remains to be said. He briefly then talks about the great courage of the Spartans. If you look at the temperance, orderliness, and ease, of grace, and magnanimity, and courage, and endurance, and the love of toil, and desire for glory and ambition of the Spartans, in all these respects, you will see that you are a child, but in comparison to them. So here, Socrates, it's a pretty brutal attack on the Athenians, actually. The Athenians are described as, inferior. Their education is worse, and so forth. And Alcibiades, at one stage of the dialogue is being told he will be the ruler of a continent, and in another stage of the dialogue he's being told he is just a simple child compared to the glory and strength of his neighbors. Well, if not of his neighbors directly, but of the Spartans of the neighboring city state. But again, this sort of humility being imposed on Alcibiades is designed to prepare him. Again, it fits the theme of do not go into government or power thinking that you know what justice is when you don't. Do not assume your superiority over the Persians and over the Spartans. And it's this arrogance which I think he's trying to warn him against. And he, throughout much of the dialogue, warns him against thinking that his looks, his wealth, and his name are going to really stand up against anything at the end of the day. That these things will give him the power to do something with his ambition. That these things, and again, this fits quite nicely into the dialogue, The Statesman,
which is quite similar to this in many ways. And there is a great warning in the Statesman against basically social relativism, against people considering their kind of status or considering their value based off of things which we could say are kind of socially relative, like wealth, like how good looking you might be, how many friends you have, and so forth. It's not to say that these things aren't useful to a certain extent, but or have no value to them or something. It's just to say that these things are not in and of themselves worthy of granting you this right to rule and to assume that you are superior than these other city states and civilizations and so forth. So how do we get there then? How do we start to be able to compare ourselves to these great kings and to kind of step outside of our arrogance and use that ambition? Because again, it's not to not use the ambition, it's to harness it and channel it and direct it in a certain way. So Socrates, later on in the dialogue, he says, my friend, be persuaded by me and hear the Delphian inscription, know thyself. Not the men whom you think, but these kings are our rivals, and we can only overcome them by pains and skill. And if you fail in the required qualities, you will fail also in becoming renowned among the Hellenes and barbarians, which you seem to desire more than any other man ever desired anything. And Socrates even admits that, and of course, Alcibiades is like, yeah, let's do it. Like, let's go there. Like, I'm all in. And Socrates kind of admits that he says we must take counsel together concerning the manner in which both of us may be most improved. For what I am telling you is the necessity of education applies to myself as well to you. And there is only one point in which I have an advantage over you. What is that? I have a guardian who is better and wiser than your guardian, Pericles. And Alcibiades says, who is he? And Socrates says, God, who up to this day has not allowed me to converse with you, and he inspires me in the faith that I am especially designed to bring you to honor. So, with the lack of good mentorship around, we must look beyond all socially relative authorities to literally God, who is not only a higher authority, but he's also endowed Socrates with the task of being Alcibiades' guardian. Next, there is a discussion of what a leader or a ruler should do. And ruling over men, ruling over a society is ultimately the goal. And this goal is then inferred by ruling over what we could call a justified division of roles or division of labor based off of knowledge. So, again, this is quite similar to the Statesman, where there's a kind of lengthy discussion about different crafts and skills that different people and in different roles have, and how they all kind of come together and complement each other in some way. So you have divisions within a society. There's a division between the people that farm, the people that are in the military, the people that blacksmiths, they make weapons. You have people who make clothes, pottery, and so forth. So you have lots of these divisions, and a part of ruling is to understand the nature of these divisions and how they work together and how they harmonize together. So there's a question of unity and division, which quite similar to the distinction between friend and enemy. There's these sort of like what we could call maybe like primordial primordial categories: friend, enemy, division, unity, and so forth, which the leader must sort of know the nature of to some extent before he can rule. So, for example, in one section they talk about the division of labor based off of the division between men and women, and he says, Socrates says, "But can a man, Alcibiades, agree with a woman about the spinning of wool, which she understands, and he does not?" And Alcibiades says, "No." Socrates says, "Nor has he any need, for a spinning is a female accomplishment." Yes. "And would a woman agree with a man about the science of arms, which she has never learned?" Certainly not. I suppose that the use of arms would be regarded by you as a male accomplishment. It would. So, and then he asks, upon your view, women and men have two sorts of knowledge. Certainly, then in their knowledge there is no agreement of women and men. Alcibiades says no. Socrates says, "Nor can there be friendship if friendship is agreement." Plainly not. And then we kind of get into the contradiction of, well, is there no friendship between? Is there no harmony between men and women just because we have different sources of knowledge? And obviously there can be, right? So we're getting into these discussions of the divisions of ourselves in society, what we do in a society, based off of knowledge. It's not, it wouldn't be compatible with, for example, a modern view of a kind of industrial society, technocratic manager industrial society, where we think, well, anyone who has this credential can do this. No, there's sorts of like capacities and roles which we can fit, which have to suit knowledge, and this knowledge is also this knowledge is also conducive to our nature as well. One can't just do anything. There has to be a harmony between your role, your knowledge, and your nature. Again, a theme which we see in the Republic, around the division of the soul and the division of society. There's a kind of harmony. So there's a division between those parts. You have the spirited, the rational, and the desiring parts, but they all have to work together. You have the military, you have the craftsman, and you have the political class, and these all have to work together. And philosophy is basically, for Plato, I think, a way of understanding, at least not exclusively, but certainly one of the most important aspects of philosophy for Plato is to understand the nature of all these things so that they can work together in some sense. So we then move into another section of the dialogue where we discuss, again, we kind of return to the theme of knowing thyself and of kind of self improvement, as we might refer to it today. It's kind of elite education. It's a specific sort of pedagogical trajectory and practice for extreme levels of virtue. I think that would be a good way to summarize it, and of course, with the intention of having political power one day. That still is the kind of practical telos to this as well. And so this part we see, a common warning Plato has against, or Socrates at least, against placing too much value on material wealth and possessions, again corresponds quite well to the guardian class in the Republic, who really take this to an extreme level. They can't own property at all, and they live very, very minimalistic lives. But this isn't quite this extreme in this dialogue, but it's an interesting comparative note. So the emphasis on knowing thyself as this part of a self-improving pedagogy, we could say, is not just moralistic. Like, he's not just saying we shouldn't have fancy stuff out of just some sort of abstract abstract frugality or something like that. He has a sort of more coherent argument for this, and I'll read out the part. He says, but should we ever have known what art makes a shoe better if we did not know a shoe? Alcibiades says, impossible. Socrates says, nor should we know what art makes a ring better if we did not know a ring. That is true. And can we ever know what art makes a man better if we do not know ourselves? If we do not know what we are ourselves. Impossible. So the task of kind of improving oneself is also reliant on asking the larger philosophic, or maybe scientific, I don't mean scientific in the modern sense, but, inquiring into the nature of man. To make a ring better is impossible. It's quite a simple and ingenious argument, actually. Like, to make a ring better is impossible if you don't know what a ring is. To make shoes better, it's possible if you don't know what shoes are. If you don't know what the end is, how can you improve something? And I think this would be a great warning against, like, social engineering projects or biotechnical so-called improvements of the modern world, where you have this constant adaptation and so-called improvement, but we don't ask, well, what are we improving? What are we as humans? We don't ask this question anymore. This is a completely antiquated question for most people, even intellectuals, to ask. What is a human? If we want to improve a human, you got to know what a human is, right? So the rejection, I suppose, of material possessions could be coherent in the sense that we don't want to understand what we are based off of things which are external, things which are purely external to us. We want to understand what a human is based off of his nature and his soul. And if we're gonna improve anything, we're gonna have to be at least supplementing our improvement with that question, or basing our improvement on that question. So and I think, again, this is actually even a good warning against modern self-improvement culture and self-help culture, because self-help and self-improvement culture, it follows that ambitious desire to be better, but it doesn't supplement it with this fundamental philosophical and ontological question of what are we, right? We have a kind of de-essentialized kind of materialized, subjectivized self-understanding in the modern world, where we don't ask this fundamental question of, like, well, what's the nature of the human in this fundamental sense. So, all of our attempts to improve are just hopeless because we don't ask that question, and that's quite obvious today, actually. So another way we could put this is, as they say in Fight Club, you're not your job, you're not your wallet, you're not your bank account, you're not your khakis. You are not your belongings, and you shouldn't think of yourself as your belongings, because you'll never improve if you do this, because you're misunderstanding what you are, which is not the belongings, it's something else. Then Socrates informs Alcibiades that the problem with the people, and this goes back to Alcibiades' desire for, we could say, for pleasing the many, or his overvaluing of the many, and he says, if basically that if the many seem to love you, it's only because of your things which are not really you, right? So or things which are in some sense related to you but aren't you in the fundamental sense that we're trying to get to. So your material wealth, your name, your looks, your charm. These are, in a sense, things that belong to you, but they're not you. And we're trying to make this distinction there. And if these people and these mentors, these kind of, as we're trying to basically, as Socrates basically says earlier, these kind of neglectful and stupid mentors that a lot of elite Athenian people have around them, if they only like you for these things that belong to you but are not you, then as soon as these things go away, they will abandon you. Basically, they will reject you. Which is quite an ingenious insight, in my opinion. It's quite evident that that is the way the world does work. And so Socrates says, and also this is a good point to make, I think, also to question the overemphasis, which a kind of liberal understanding of kind of Greek pedagogy as being kind of homoerotic. I think this is a good point to reinterpret what they actually mean by lover, right? No doubt that they do use some homoerotic kind of metaphors, like, but what this actually means in practice is not exactly what I think sometimes we're told, especially considering Socrates is normally attracted to the soul, he's not attracted to the body, right? So anyway, so Socrates says, the reason was that I loved you for your own sake, whereas other men love what belongs to you, and your beauty, which is not you, is fading away, just as your true self is beginning to bloom. And I will never desert you if you are not spoiled and deformed by the Athenian people. Deformed, which is a pretty interesting word. For the danger which I most fear is that you will become a lover of the people and will be spoiled by them. Many a noble Athenian has been ruined in this way, for the demos of the great-hearted Erechtheus is of a fair countenance, but you should see him naked. Wherefore observe the caution which I give you. Again, common theme in Plato, which is that nudity and nakedness has a metaphysical dimension to it. It's also the stripping away of the exterior to see someone's soul, and of course this is a sort of necessary task, we could say, for one to encounter proper philosophical life, proper philosophical thought, and so forth. So Socrates kind of basically says, so stick with me, buddy, and we'll do great things. And you know what? They did. Even though both of them ultimately ended up either exiled or killed by their own people. But nonetheless, we remember them today for a reason. We don't remember fucking, Alcibiades' apparently stupid brother. We don't remember him. We remember Alcibiades. So there is some sort of justice in that. And the very end of the first Alcibiades, at least, ends with this kind of ominous prediction of the future, we could say, where it says, Socrates says, my love breeds another love, and so like the stork I shall be cherished by the bird whom I have hatched. Alcibiades says, strange but true, and hence strange but true, and henceforward I shall begin to think about justice. And then Socrates ends and says, and I hope that you will persist, although I have fears, not because I doubt you, but I see the power of the state, which may be too much for both of us.